So, why are they titling this Mormons and the mainstream? We should think about what the mainstream actually means, and what it used to mean, and what it means today. A good launching point to this would be thinking in terms of the Broadway show, The Book of Mormon, which is a huge hit. How did that get started? Those of you who are in the know about that. Anyone remember who wrote it? Or
the South Park people.
Exactly. And so what do you think got it? They did an episode about Latter-day Saints. And in it they were, as the South Park people do, they're sort of equal opportunity when it comes to religions. They make fun of everybody's beliefs, everybody's worship, everybody's structure, organization, everybody's culture. Actually, one thing I do like about them is they don't play any favorites. And they saw that they're sort of talking about the same stuff in this book. They're doing it in a satirical, comedic way, but they're talking about these tensions that Mormons face within American culture and their perception of other Americans of them and their religion. And when we say tension, we've talked about this a lot before with other groups. There's the broader American culture, and that might be dominated by one group or another. We'll talk about which groups were dominating in a moment. And then, every religious group has distinctive beliefs, distinctive practices. That's what makes them what they are. That's what we call their identity. So, if you think about yourself, you have a personal identity as, so-and-so. I'm not going to say any names because we're recording this, but part of that could be constituted by your gender, part of that could be constituted by your background, part of that could be constituted what part of the nation you actually grew up in. If you listen to my voice, you realize I'm not from here because I speak with a sort of Midwestern Wisconsin accent. When I say Wisconsin, that comes out. That's part of my identity. Now, the tension is this. We saw this just a little bit before with Catholics, and we're going to see it with Judaism. How much do you adapt yourself to this? Because if you want to fit in and you want to get by, it sure helps to look and sound and think and behave like everybody else. But if you want to hold on to your identity, that's not really going to be a full option for you, is it? There's a tension here. You have to make decisions. And so religious groups do this sort of thing. Let's think about this end of it. Now, the American mainstream, if we're talking about as this chapter begins, like the 1870s, the 1880s, who's the American mainstream? Who is the dominant establishment, religiously speaking, in America at that time? It's not the Catholics, right? Yeah.
Protestants?
Yeah, and which Protestants, if we had to have a big general term for it? It's one we've used a lot this semester. Protestants is right. Is it the Lutherans? Not really. Episcopalians? Yeah.
Presbyterian?
Now we're starting to get into that broader designation, because the Presbyterians have less ritual, less liturgy. Think about this term evangelical that we've used, right? When we talked about the sort of establishment, they're the ones who are more or less dominating American culture at that time, and so they're the ones that the Mormons are looking to as sort of, both rivals. They're the dominant culture, and so if you want to be a subculture, you have to be kind of opposed to it. But also they're adapting to them to a certain extent. Are evangelical Protestants the sort of majority American culture force at this time? Not really. They've become sort of a subculture, haven't they? And there really isn't something that we can call the one single group that predominates. But we could say something like secular society. What do we mean by a secular society? a society in which religion plays less and less and less of a role, in which it's sort of relegated to the margins. And so Mormons have been, existing in tension with the mainstream. Secular society can have religious people in it, but religious people are sort of expected to keep their mouths shut and their heads down, keep their beliefs and practices to themselves, or only do it on Sunday or Saturday or whatever, right? Make religion to be something sort of quaint and not really an issue. So it's changed over time, who they're counterpoising themselves against. As a matter of fact, one of the things your book talks about, as time has gone on and as secularism became much stronger, Latter-day Saints found that they actually had a lot in common with evangelical Protestants. They actually had a lot in common with the sort of, we might call it Norman Rockwell America of, mom, apple pie, baseball, that sort of, stereotype. They had a lot more in common with that than they do with the contemporary secular society. They are rather conservative in many respects. So this is all stuff to sort of keep in mind. Your book talks about some changes that take place in the 1890s. This President Wilford, we'll talk about what a president means to them in a moment, he has a manifesto, and it brings to an end the distinctive practice. What's the first thing that you think about when somebody says Mormon? Still today, probably? Polygamy, yeah. Now, most Mormons are not polygamous. There was a time where that wouldn't be true. But at least with the main church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that's centered out in Utah, which represents the majority of Mormons, that ended in 1890. That actually led to some splits because some people said, no, we're going to keep the polygamy. They're outside of the main Mormon church. They're what the book refers to as Mormon fundamentalists. Not the best term for them, but you might say, sort of originalists or radical Mormons or whatever designation you want for that. There were a lot of other changes that took place at the time. Your book brings up physical separation, doctrinal peculiarity, economic semi-communitarianism. Well, what does that mean? That's a long word. Semi-communitarianism. What would communitarianism mean? Then we'll worry about the semi. That's not a term that they defined earlier. It was a communitarian. You guys familiar with this term? No? Well, yeah.
Is it something like individual and community? Like they want to...
Did you say individual community?
Individual and community, they want to become one? Or...
Yeah, the individuals are sort of, you have your meaning as an individual within the community. So, if you think about the sort of practices that they engaged in Utah, like these massive land reclamation out of the desert, that takes a lot of people not thinking about themselves and thinking about the larger project, the common good, submerging themselves in kind of a group identity. That's what they're talking about there. That all sort of went away. Your book talks about the ending of polygamy, but I'm not going to talk very much about that. Let's look at some of these other shifts that took place. Like your book says, Mormons are now among the most vocal advocates of individualistic capitalism in the nation. That's a big shift away from a communal identity, isn't it? Because individualistic capitalism means I've got my stuff, you've got your stuff, keep your hands off of my stuff. And if we want to cooperate, we'll write a contract. And you can pay me or I can pay you. But it's not about some big common good. It's about whatever the market can tolerate, whatever you can get for your goods and services in the market. So Mormonism, like your book points out, adapted to its incorporation in American society. Not by abandoning its earlier practices and values, but by creating a network of beliefs, values, and structures, and all this stuff over here, capable of maintaining their identity as a distinctive people in the face of the pressures of religious competition mainly with Protestants, and resisting secularization. Secularization in religious terms means religious people quit being religious. They become secular. So, here's a prime example of this. many college students find when they go off to college, they may have been attending religious services regularly with their family when they were in high school, because that was expected in the family. Then they get to college, and what happens? What's your, not necessarily your experience, but you've seen this happen with a lot of people. They keep going? Mm-hmm. Some do, but what do most do? Yeah, they sleep in on Sunday, right? It's nice to have brunch, you know, and there's all sorts of things that come up like that. That's becoming more and more secular. And so somebody might still identify, well, I'm still a Baptist, I'm still a Catholic. But if you're not actually practicing it, the sense in which you're a this or that becomes kind of, you know, anemic, becomes kind of watered down. And so they're trying to avoid that sort of stuff, the Latter-day Saints. They're trying to avoid secularism. Your book talks about them having a distinct set of beliefs or theology, a distinct way of worship. We'll talk about that in a moment. A structure or organization that's similar and yet different from other religious organizations. And all of these are so tightly connected that they constitute a culture, or what we might call a subculture within American society. There's a distinctively Latter-day Saints or Mormon way of living out religious identity. So let's start with belief. Your book talks about, and this is just review for you, the unique revelation with Joseph Smith, who's claimed to have derived it through his encounters with this angel Moroni. The authenticity of the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith's prophetic roles are cardinal points of faith. This came up in that South Park episode, didn't it? Right? How many of you have seen the South Park Mormon episode? Only a few of you? How many of you like South Park? Okay, so later on today, you know, go and look it up. It's very funny. You may find it offensive, perhaps, but you know, like I said, South Park equal opportunity offenders. They go after everybody, even the non-religious people too. But you notice that one of the key things that comes up in there is, what about this Golden Tablet stuff? What about this Book of Mormon stuff? And they say, you have to take this as a matter of faith. These are what we would call articles of faith. These are things that, if you compromise that, you're not going to have an awful lot left after that happens. What else? Let's look at some of these other key things about their belief system. It talks about a lack of sense of transcendence. Transcendence means where you've got, you know, something that's much higher than something else, and there's a radical break between it. So, for example, in traditional Christian theology, human beings and angels are distinct kinds of beings. You know, I remember when my mom died, she had lots and lots of people came to the funeral. I was in the receiving line for about 6 hours because she was so popular, and she was she was the secretary for a massive club. And a lot of these people would come through, and you know, you guys have all been to funerals. You shake people's hands, you say, "I'm sorry for your loss," and then you might say it a little bit. So a lot of these people would say things like, "Well, she's an angel in heaven looking down on us now." That shows a sort of lack of transcendence. Traditional Christian theology, human beings don't become angels. They're radically distinct types of being. And the angels, at least the ones that didn't fall, are somehow, you know, transcendent to the human world that we're within, the world of our ordinary experience. So when you say there's a lack of transcendence, it doesn't mean that there's no God, it doesn't mean there's no divine beings. It means that there's a continuity between the human, what it is that we experience, like, you know, you're looking at me, hearing things, and the supernatural or the divine. So they kind of interpenetrate each other. Your book talks about their view, what we would call their anthropology, their view of human nature. Human beings are not really that different from God in this point of view. They're uncreated and eternal. They're capable of change and development, both in this world and the world to come. One other really telling difference, they don't believe in original sin. In their view, there are sins, but there's no radically flawed human nature from the start. So humanity, like it says, thus enjoys extraordinary freedom to fashion itself into something quite literally divine. Are Mormons the only people who believe in this? No, because there's a long-standing traditional Christian notion of theosis, of becoming God. But it's always been kind of at the fringes. They talk about life in this world is not the beginning or the end of human existence. Human beings enjoyed a pre-existence before. They left voluntarily, and then they grow further in knowledge, and then depending on how they behave, that determines where they go in the afterlife. So these are all things that would fall under the theology, the beliefs. Structure or organization. This is something very important too. You can't have a religious institution continuing very long without somebody actually, doing the day-to-day things of organizing, of making sure that the lights come on in the church, of actually doing Sunday school, In the case of Latter-day Saints, they talk about, first, the distinction between genders. So this is a very, traditional conservative faith in that it sees men and women as having complementary roles, not as doing the same thing. Patriarchal imagery from the Hebrew Scriptures was informing Joseph Smith's vision, and so what do we see here? Traditional gender roles for women, which would mean what? Being lawyers, high-powered executives. What are traditional gender roles? Whether you like them or don't.
Stay-at-home moms.
Yeah, and so you see a lot of it. The idea is that the man is supposed to be earning, providing for the family, and the household is where the woman is supposed to be attending to everything, making sure that doesn't fall apart. That's a lot of work, actually. You'll find this out when you have to manage a household. There's a lot of thinking involved in managing a household. Your book talks about priesthoods as well. And Joseph Smith, through these revelations, he said that what was happening was a restoration of the ancient Hebrew priesthoods, the Aaronic and Melchizedekian priesthood. How that actually plays out in practice is as a young man, or really a youth, is growing, he's progressing through some stages, some roles. And your book talks about being a deacon. Deacon means a servant. Not a servant like a slave, but a servant as somebody who actually serves other people. Is the original Greek term. A teacher and priest. And then they're recognized as adults through initiation into the status of elder. Now you might say, well, that's kind of weird to be an elder when you're only 19 years old. But remember, this is coming out of the frontier, where all of us would actually, I would be a pretty old person, and you'd already be established in whatever profession it is that you're doing, and you'd have been doing it for quite a while. As elders, they spend 2 years supported by themselves as missionaries, either in the United States or abroad. They go all over the place. I just ran into a kid who was about to leave on his mission work, going to Britain, of all places, at a conference. That's all sort of individual human being structure, right? Then what about organization? They have the ward and the stake. And the ward you can think of as sort of like a parish. It's about the same size as a lot of parishes in traditional Christian churches. And they'll have, a sacrament, they'll have a sacramental meeting that's taking place at the ward chapel. That's the religious service that they're attending weekly. The first Sunday of each month, they have a fast and testimonies Sunday, where the worshipers are abstaining from food. They're fasting for 24 hours, and then they offer personal testimonies. What are they doing in their services? Talks, hymn singing, administration of the sacrament of communion. Notice it's not wine, it's not even grape juice, it's bread and water. That's all happening at the ward level. That's where families are coming together. Then the stake is composed of a number of wards. So you could think of that as something like a diocese or like a synod. Depends on what organization that you're in. At this level, they have temples. There's always new temples, like your book points out, in the process of being built. There's a main temple in Salt Lake City. But as Latter-day Saints have spread out throughout the United States, spilling out of Utah, if you actually look at, remember that map that I showed you at the beginning of the semester, where you can see that large parts of Arizona, Nevada, Idaho, they're the predominant group within that area. They need, to have a central place to go to. And we'll talk about why temples are particularly important in a moment. So at the higher levels, they have these stakes. These are administrative units that usually have about 8 to 12 wards. They have a president, but the president is actually 3 people. A president with 2 counselors, a presidency, and then they'll have a high council of 12 or 15. It's what they call, your book calls it gerontocracy. Have you ever heard of this word? This is a good word to learn, because this is a complete aside, but your lives as young Americans are very much determined by old people. What your economic prospects are, what's going to be available to you, what the nation looks like, is really not in the hands of my generation. It's in the hands of the generation before me, the baby boomers. And they've done a lot of good things and a lot of bad things, and they have determined the kind of expectations that you can have. They're also living a hell of a lot longer and not getting out of the way for any of the younger generations to move up. They're going to run the show for a long time. That's what you call a gerontocracy. Literally, rule by the aged. In this case, it's more individuated, but that's what that term actually means when you come across that in your book. Now, your book talks about a few other things having to do with structure, in terms of shrines, in terms of the main temple. The main temple it talks about in terms of that axis mundi. Remember that idea from really early on? Shrines for places that were important. So we're talking about, in Missouri, Illinois, New York, the Joseph Smith story, all of that. Let's talk now about worship, though. How are they distinctive in worship? We mentioned a little bit about what they're doing at the ward level. There's a number of other things that are happening, and they're happening at the temple level. And the ward bishop decides who gets to go on to the temple, and that's where these ordinances, which are held to be very important for Latter-day Saints, are actually occurring. So, what would be examples of these? We've talked about baptism for the dead before. Just a quick review. The idea was people who died from your family, your ancestors, who didn't have the opportunity to run into this new revelation, the Book of Mormon, they kind of got screwed, didn't they? This is a classic problem that missionary religions have had. What about the people who didn't get to hear the message? Are they in a one-down position? Well, by being baptized as a proxy for your ancestors, you would be offering them that possibility of salvation. So that's part of why the Latter-day Saints have been so interested in genealogy. They are a major resource for everybody. Researchers use their stuff. Endowment ceremonies and sealing ceremonies are 2 others that your book talks about. And these are really unique to Latter-day Saints. Endowment ceremonies are these rites of initiation undergone by young adults before setting off on missionary work or marriage, and it involves a ritual bathing and anointing with oil. Then this happens in the temple, not in the ward. Sealing ceremonies bind a man and woman together for time and eternity. So, as opposed to, think about what marriage vows usually comprise, right? How many of you are planning on getting married sometime? Okay. I don't raise my hand because I'm already married. So it'd be weird if I was planning to do it again. What do the vows include? What do you want your spouse to be saying they're going to do?
They're committed to you.
Yeah, they're not going to sleep with anybody else, right? They're not even supposed to like get attached to anybody else, right? So that's important. What else? Yeah.
To be there when you're sick.
Yeah, through sickness and health, rich and poor. You don't want them to abandon you when you go bankrupt either, right? So, what else? Oh, well, actually, let's follow up on that one because that's going where I want to go. How does it go? Rich or poor, sickness or health. How long? Forever and ever?
Till death do us part.
Till death do us part. So that's saying, okay, I'm going to be a little facetious here. So I love my wife, but if she gets sick and dies, well, we had a good run. Now it's okay for me to find somebody else. That kind of goes against some of our notions of like, when you marry somebody, they're supposed to be the one, right? We have these romantic notions. For these sealing ceremonies, they're literally saying, we're going to be together through eternity. No death do us part. In the afterlife, we're going to be together. So that's really distinctive there. You've got to be very committed to do that sort of thing. It also talks about some other things occurring with worship. Body of folk songs, many dealing with the hardships endured during the trek to Utah. Persists does a distinctive Mormon hymnody. They have their own musical traditions. There's also an entire folklore surrounding, these sort of providential deliverances, legends about Smith and Brigham Young. And then your book mentions the story of the three Nephites. And these are these three strangers who mysteriously appear to help Mormons in distress, and then they vanish. The story is still making sort of anonymous rounds. Your book also talks about their culture, this work, health, education, recreation complex. That's something that's stressed within not just the teachings of the church, but within the entire community. So you see everybody else doing this sort of stuff, and then that makes it a lot easier to do. Now your book talks about the political and sort of social conservatism of Latter-day Saints. Some examples of this. Until 1978, black males were barred from the priesthoods, and then the president, said, "Well, we have to change that. I've had a revelation," and they've done that. But that's pretty recent, right? That's a generation and a half from now. Mormon attitudes towards the role of women remain very conservative. These traditional gender roles. So recently, your book also talks about there was a policy known as correlation. This is a policy of sort of controlling the development of church teachings and activities, keeping them within the hands of the centralized church, so that they did this through a lot of pamphlets and directives, and that kind of reduces local autonomy, local expressions. Your book talks about their involvement in politics. Which way do you think these guys would vote? Republican or Democrat?
Republican.
Yeah, I mean, conservative party, tends to draw that. They're actually the religious group. There's two groups demographically that are most easy to predict when it comes to presidential elections. One is African Americans for Democrats. The other is Latter-day Saints for Republicans. At this time. That may change. But at this time, those are the easiest predictors. Mitt Romney who ran in the recent election. He is a Latter-day Saint. He actually had to give some speeches explaining how, was this compatible with, say, being the president and taking care of all of America. He actually gave some very interesting speeches about the role of faith in public life, not so much in the last election, but in the one before that, when McCain was the candidate. Those are well worth reading. The last thing your book talks about is some other groups that are Latter-day Saints. And it really only talks about three groups. One has more or less died out. That's the Strangites, the ones who follow Joseph Strang. They have dwindled. They're pretty much negligible. And the other two groups would be kind of at opposite ends of the spectrum. One of them is what used to be called the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is kind of a mouthful, isn't it? It's a lot easier now. They're called the Community of Christ. They changed their name to emphasize that they're a lot more like evangelical Protestants in many ways, or actually mainline Protestants, because theologically they're quite liberal. They ordain women. They don't make any sort of racial differentiation. They're open to ecumenical relations with other Christian groups. They're pretty small as a group. They don't have the numbers that the main Latter-day Saints church has. But they are still out there, and they're still a presence. They have their temple in Missouri, and their temple is actually, you can visit it. It's open. That's probably enough about them. The other groups that we would think about are the ones that, even down to this day, give people the impression that the first thing we think about when we think about Mormons is polygamy, right? Those would be what we call the fundamentalist Mormons. They would be even further to the right than the Latter-day Saints. They're the ones that are out, usually in the deserts, places where it's harder to get to them. Although, like your book points out, there are a few, in the Salt Lake City area. They just keep a very low presence because polygamy is illegal. That was something that they had to deal with early on. Some of them said, no, we're going to continue this. So I'm sure all of you have seen some of the TV shows, about sister wives and things like that. Those are not about main church Latter-day Saints. Those are about those splinter groups. So that's pretty much it for Latter-day Saints for our class. I suppose one thing I ought to do, since we are wrapping this stuff up, is ask, are there any questions that you guys have about Latter-day Saints that we haven't actually looked at? Any things that were like in the back of your mind? Or should we go on to other topics? All right, good. We'll go on to Judaism.